Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. We want to tell you about an op-ed that ran in the New York Times over the weekend you might not have seen. The writer, who's a law professor in New York called Echo Yonka, asked a simple question: can my children be friends with white people? He really asked it, and he wasn't optimistic. Quote, "I will teach my boys the lesson generations old," he wrote. "I will teach them to be cautious. I will teach them suspicion. I will teach them distrust. I will teach my boys to have profound doubts that friendship with white people is possible." Those doubts mirrored the writer's own. As he put it, quote, "History has provided little reason for people of color to trust white people." That piece was one of the most popular on the New York Times website, even today. It was hardly unusual, though. Go to any liberal website, Salon, Slate, Vox, HuffPo, and you'll find similar pieces arguing that an entire racial group is untrustworthy and dangerous. This is a big change for the left. For most of the 20th century, liberals, and it was noble, argued that it was immoral to reward or punish people based on their skin color. Individuals ought to be judged solely by the choices they make. Anything less is bigotry. Liberals don't say that anymore. What happened? Echo Yonka is the author of that New York Times piece. He's a professor at Shiva University's Benjamin Cardozo School of Law, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So what struck me about this piece, a couple of different things, but the first thing was the generalizations about a racial group based on their race. And I grew up, I'm probably not so much older than you, in a world where overt expressions of that were not acceptable. You weren't allowed to generalize on the basis of race because the assumption was each person is an individual and you judge each person by the choices he or she makes. I don't understand when it became okay to generalize about racial groups.
Well, I mean, it's to me, a strange way to put the question. I mean, while it's the case that we all hope that we can be judged for who we are, I think while some people have the luxury to be raised only being told to look at individual people, it should be no surprise to you that black people, in particular black men, have been taught forever that they have to be careful how they behave around white people, that the way they behave will be interpreted differently, that when they misbehave, it'll be punished differently, that if they laugh too loud, if they walk into a nice store. So with all due respect, Tucker, what was true for you has never been true for lots of people.
Well, I guess there are a lot of ways to respond to that. One, on a factual basis, and in truth, in a lot of places in this country, the main threat that African Americans face is not from white people, as you perfectly well know. But beyond that, the idea that you could understand a person's motive merely by knowing his race dehumanizes that person. It's the definition of racism, and yet you're engaging in it in the New York Times, and nobody says anything about it. And I just felt it was worth pointing that out and asking you if you feel it's okay to generalize about people you've never met, about whom you know nothing beyond what they look like, and say, I know who you are and what you believe.
So I first want to respond to the first comment. I think is ought not be let lie. While it's true that, of course, people of color face threats from other people of color, it's also true that white people face the overwhelming threat from white people. That is, right. People face threats from who they live beside. So I find it
exactly.
But I think it's fair to point out that we oughtn't be distasteful and say things like, well, the great threat. It does feed a certain uglier narrative that we don't want. But to your core point,
wait, hold on. Why does the truth ever feed a quote ugly narrative? The truth is worth telling for its own sake because it's true.
You're welcome to tell the truth, but it is deeply suspicious that people are so quick to say things like the main threat facing African Americans is other African Americans, but you never hear anybody say the main threat facing white people is white people, right? So there is no phrase white on white.
I don't know. People say that. I guess the point is,
Tucker,
you don't face a threat from an entire racial group. You face a threat from individuals who've made individual choices.
Well, we should turn to that. But just in closing, I should say we should be honest and not pretend that there is a phrase like white on white violence. Right. That phrase doesn't exist for very particular
we
reasons.
Can invent it here. But I guess the point I'm making is that you should never generalize about people on the basis of their skin color because it reduces them to the sum total of their skin color. And again, that's the definition of racism. And you're engaging in it in this piece. And I don't think it's helpful. I think it's wrong.
Well, so I just entirely deny that. What I said was that you should generalize and dislike people because of their skin color. What I do think is true is that in a world in which things have gotten ever more dangerous for people of color, it is in fact the case, that undermines our ability to trust each other across racial bounds. And here's what's true, or at least here's what I wrote. Not that white people are unavailable for friendship, but in this world, it is up to our white friends and allies to be sure to stand up for those who are under attack. If I want to prove that I'm the kind of person who can be your friend, that means that when something's actually threatening you, I actually have to be there for you.
Okay, but again, you're making generalizations across racial groups. So you say, for example, I will have to discuss with my boys whether they can truly be friends with white people. History has provided little reason for people of color to trust white people. I have profound doubts that friendship with white people is possible. Again, these are... Okay,
yeah,
but
that's absolutely right.
If I were to write, you know, I was mugged as a pizza delivery boy, and I told my children that they should never trust anyone who looks like the people who mugged me, that would be, I would never do that. I think that would be immoral. But it would be the definition of racism, because I would be equating the people who mugged me with everyone else who looks like them.
I think if that's the only part of the article you read, it might sound like that. But of course, the article has a much richer argument. And the argument I make is, look, in a country where it turns out that when the most vulnerable people of color are under threat, those who they count on are nowhere to be seen, or at least for some group of people, and I speak explicitly about the political moment we're in today, right? So if we have a president who marshals forces of hatred and anger and divisiveness and, frankly, just danger, quite aside from who he is, I'm not particularly interested in who he is, if the people who call themselves your friends are not going to push back against that, then maybe you can tell me why it is I should trust those people?
Well, so I guess what you're saying is that people who don't agree with your politics can't be your friends, which I think is an unfortunate conclusion to reach, but it's different from the one you articulate here. You're making, again, for the third time, generalizations based on race, and the truth about the last election is this is not a defense of Donald Trump, merely an acknowledgement of the fact that he received more African-American votes than any Republican since 2004. I think he had 8% of African-American men. So that's not a huge number, but that's tens of thousands of people. Are they in the same category too? Can you not trust them? I mean, I don't really understand. If you're saying you can't trust Trump voters, fine.
Sure.
But white people? I mean, that's a grotesque generalization and a divisive one.
I'm a little worried that you keep reading the same parts without, I mean, you would make it seem as though the entire piece was just that paragraph. So the piece goes on to say...
Well, it's the title of the piece, and it's in separate graphs.
Yeah. So I have no problem standing behind the title of the piece, but it is worth pointing out, as I'm again and again, what the piece says is, when those who count themselves as your friend see that others put you in danger, it is their opportunity to prove they're your friend. And if we have let's just speak plainly about this. Tucker, you have children like I do, right?
I do.
And if your daughters were, I don't know, friendly with a group of people, and it just turned out that repeatedly, when they went out and your daughters were in danger, those group of young men just disappeared. I think at some point you tell your daughters, look, it's fine to be friendly with them, but these are not your friends. You can't
but I guess
count on
I would,
them.
because I'm not a racist, what I wouldn't say is anybody of a certain race falls into that category. I would never do that.
So
again, if one of my daughters was mugged by someone of a certain color, I would never say to my daughter, that's more evidence you can never trust anyone who looks like that, because I would be inculcating race hatred in my children, as you are.
So well, I mean, obviously I deny that. Look, what I said over and over was, we live in a country where we oughtn't pretend that these divides have not consistently been on racial grounds. And we see that over and over and over. When black people are in danger...
That's true. I agree.
When black people are in danger from, say, addiction, we get policing. When white people are in danger from addiction, they get rehabilitation. When black people don't have jobs, we get stories about why we're making the wrong choices. When white people don't have jobs, we get a presidential campaign about the forgotten class.
Well, you know, it's actually...
So to be fair,
look, I mean, these are subjects I know a lot about, and I think those are gross generalizations, so let me just say I don't accept them, but I get your point.
I'm going to go ahead and I'll finish, and then I'm happy to hear your point of view. So if it's the case that we live in a country where these divides have always consistently been racial, then I think it's not only delusional, but it would be dangerous of me not to teach my boys that when they walk out in the world, there'll be a world that treats them differently because of their race.
Should I say the same thing to my children?
Yeah,
that there are African-American law professors who dislike you because of your color, and you should dislike him back?
No.
And all African-American law professors? I would never say that, because that's grotesque.
No,
and again, it's race hatred.
So, I mean, you keep saying the same thing, and I keep trying to say...
Because I can't get past it.
Apparently. So what I've said over and over is, look, what matters when people are in danger, if you're going to say that you're the kind of person they can trust as a friend, is you have to step up. And when it's the case that these friendship lines break down on racial lines, then it's your turn to step up because of these racial lines. So if I know that in my school there's a tense point because everybody hates the Filipino student, when the Filipino student walks into my area, I'm going to make sure that he knows I'm an ally. I'm not going to disappear when he's in danger, and then placate myself by saying I'm his friend. I can't. No, you can't have it both ways.
No, but I agree with you. It's when you implicate people you don't know simply because of how they look that you cross the line. Let me just ask you another question. I'll let you answer it quickly, which is, how would you feel if I told my children in an op-ed in the New York Times what you told your children, but the colors were reversed?
Actually, Sucker, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Will you teach your girls to be cautious around men until they prove that they are men that can be trusted?
Men, but not men of a certain race, because I don't think that the races are as different as you think they are. You think one is good and one is evil. That's what you said in your piece.
I didn't at all say that in the piece, and if you can cite that, I'd be very happy to see it. But
you said you can't trust them.
I did say it. No, I did say that, and I think in the same way.
Making headway, but I'm going to give you. I asked you a question. Can you answer it? How would you feel if I wrote that piece?
No, forgive me. You asked me a question, and I returned the question, so I want to conclude on that. Look, in the same way that you will teach your daughters to be careful around men until they prove that they can be gentlemen, if somebody said, "Oh my God, that's outrageous! Tucker Carlson is teaching his daughters that men are evil," that would be laughable.
You're conflating sex with race.
Forgive me.
No, you forgive me because we acknowledge differences between the sexes, but not significant ones between the races. And so that's sophism. What you're doing
I don't think it's sophism at all. I find it remarkable that you can live in the America we live in and pretend that we oughtn't see that racial lines are equally divisive.
That's not what I was saying. I said, would you be okay with me writing this piece to my children if the races were reversed?
Because the facts are different, Tucker.
Okay. Listen, because one goes bad, one's good. All right, got it.
That's absurd. If I don't teach my boys how to be cautious, how to be careful, how to be perceived in the right way, I'm not just risking their feelings being hurt. I'm risking their bodies being broken.
Should I teach my kids that?
You don't teach your daughters to be cautious until they can be sure that the men around them are trustworthy?
That's not what the conversation is about. It's not about sex. It's about race.
Right.
And no, I don't teach them that there are dramatic differences between the races because I'm not a bigot.
So to be sure, it's fine for you to care for your daughters and make sure that they're healthy and well. But if I care for my sons in the same way...
That is sophism, ladies and gentlemen. We're out of time. Thank you, Professor. I appreciate it. You're coming on and explaining that. Thank you. Jeremy Hunt is an active U.S. Army officer. He's a leadership strategist for the Douglas Leadership Institute, and he joins us tonight. Mr. Hunt, thanks a lot for coming on.
It's great to be on with you.
It's great to be on with you. It just seems to me, the reason I want to do that segment was I feel like there's a lot of, to be blunt, racial tension in America, and I want to make sure that everyone with a public voice is doing his or her best to make it better. And part of that means treating people as individuals rather than as caricatures, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, and of course, everything I say on the air is just my personal views. I just find it incredible that here we have a law professor spewing out such divisive rhetoric, stoking fear. I mean, when I was young, my father taught me just the basic principle. He said, me, especially as a Christian, that I should love my neighbor regardless of their race, that I should strive to live in harmony with people, regardless of what they look like. I mean, these are basic principles that people learn in grade school. How is it that at 24, I'm having to tell a law professor not to make these generalizations of entire groups of people?
It does seem like that is the line. I mean, you have to keep alive the possibility that just because people look alike doesn't mean they are alike. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I look like, I guess, there are a lot of terrible white people through history. I'd hate to take responsibility for their crimes. Do you know what I mean? I want to take responsibility for what I do and not what anyone else does. That seems fair to me.
Exactly, and the more we kind of engage and entertain these conversations about how entire groups of people are racist, the more we're actually playing into the hand of actual racists. I mean, if you're a white supremacist in this country, you're guaranteed news coverage. You're guaranteed to talk about all these great things, and we play right into their hand. I mean, we are basically carrying out their goal of a divided United States when we see pieces like this come out in the New York Times. I mean, it is deeply disturbing.
When did we start believing in collective guilt? You're responsible for things done by people you've never met. When did that become a concept? I thought the whole point of America was that we don't believe that.
Well, exactly. And basically, if you look at after the civil rights movement, the new kind of protest politics, they took on this new line of basically everyone's going to feel this collective guilt, and we're going to trade you some type of moral authority in exchange for making you feel better about your guilt. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's divisive. And instead of viewing people based on the content of their character, we're still seeing this this kind of movement to try to basically make displays of social justice, and make displays of, oh, we're helping the inner city community or whatever it might be, without actually looking to see if these policies are actually having a positive effect in our country.
Yeah, it's creating wounds that will not heal for a long time, unfortunately. Mr. Trump, thank you very much.
That's exactly right.
Good to see you. Middle-class Americans under a lot of stress these days. Will the House Republican tax plan actively help them or not? We'll put that question to a top House Republican, one of the people who wrote the legislation. That's next. Congressional Republicans attempting to hammer out a tax reform bill that a majority of Congress is willing to pass. Who would win and who would lose under a final compromise? Will the bill do anything to help the people in America who are under the most stress? Congressman Kevin Brady represents Texas. He's the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which is a big deal in Washington. He joins us now. Mr. Chairman, thanks for coming on.
Tucker, thanks for having me.
So under this proposed legislation, the White House is saying that corporations will get a tax cut in order to create more jobs and raise wages. Would there be a way to structure the legislation where corporations don't get a tax cut unless they demonstrably raise wages and create jobs?
Well, look, the key here is people tend to think of, so what are their profits? Does that grow my paycheck? But the other P word that we're actually focused on is productivity.
Right.
Businesses aren't investing. They've been on about a decade-long slide. They're not investing in new plants, new equipment, software, technology. That's what drives productivity. That gives you those bigger paychecks. So we're going all in for growth for businesses. We redesign the code so our local companies can compete and win anywhere in the world. But most importantly, for the first time in history, we unleash business investment by letting them immediately write off from their taxes that new investment in plants or equipment, software and technology. It really drives Main Street jobs.
But there's no, I mean, because businesses are sitting on a huge amount of cash, stock market's at record levels, corporate profits really high, productivity's good, and yet we still have a persistently large number of people not working. Is there any way to tie their benefits to that, to wages and jobs?
So it really does. Investment drives productivity. We've been on a decade-long slide for worker productivity. We used to be one of the best. We've really slid in a big way. That's why paychecks aren't going up. The other thing is we can't compete internationally anymore. We've slid, I think, 31st out of 35 of our major competitors. They've just blown by us. So we're losing jobs in research and manufacturing overseas. And the worst thing for your paycheck is to see it go overseas. So this tax plan is all about leapfrogging America, back in that lead pack. More importantly, unleashing all that local business investment that we just haven't seen for far too long.
So some people's taxes are going to go up, and you're going to see some people paying like Carter-level tax, 55% all in. Particularly in New York and California. Does that, I mean, the idea of someone paying the majority of his salary to the government, is that acceptable?
Yeah, so I don't believe they will. So I can see, so we've lowered the rates at every level, doubled the standard deduction, brand new family tax credit that more people can use than ever before. In every scenario I run, up at every income level, people see tax relief, including in high tax states like New York City.
So you don't see anybody at the end getting his taxes raised?
So I believe every American is going to be better off, either with lower taxes or higher paychecks going forward, and in high tax states, because we keep the mortgage deduction, the charitable deduction, the property tax deduction, twice the national average. All of that adds, in my view, Tucker, to tax relief.
I certainly want that to be true for sure. But Mitch McConnell the other day said nobody in the middle class is going to see his taxes go up, and then he walked it back famously and said, well, actually, maybe some people. I mean, that scared people hearing
Well,
that.
what I know is this. When you double that standard deduction, lower the rates at every level, create this new family tax credit, that provides relief across the board. And the Joint Committee on Tax said there is income tax relief at every income level.
So if that turns out not to be true when the Senate's done with it, do you think the President will sign it?
Well, I do think the President will sign this bill, but I'll tell you this as well. So we're getting ready historically to pass tax reform in the House this week. We're Republicans. We like to make improvements at every step. So we're continuing as the Senate moves forward, as we work together for that final bill. I'm looking to make improvements in tax relief at every level. So we're not even done yet. This step in the House really moves us another big step forward, but not to a final bill yet.
But your pledge as chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee is that nobody is going to wind up with less money if this passes.
In my belief, between these tax cuts and higher paychecks and growth, whether you're that worker on Main Street or that small business on Main Street, you're going to see more in your paycheck. You're going to see more in your pocketbook.
All right. Well, I'm rooting for that, of course.
Thanks,
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.
The Trump dossier justified months of news coverage, helped spark a national federal investigation. Was it all a dirty trick? We'll talk to someone who has details on that, written extensively about it. Stay tuned. This is a Fox News alert. We've learned tonight that Attorney General Jeff Sessions has ordered federal prosecutors to evaluate the Uranium One deal for possible irregularities. That evaluation could result in the appointment of a special counsel to investigate it. Sessions' order was given in response to a request by congressional Republicans. We'll continue to follow that DOJ investigation. Uranium One, of course, paid the Podesta Group to lobby on its behalf, and we have an update on the Podesta Group as well. A few weeks ago, we told you how the Podesta people had become the center of independent counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russia's influence on American politics. It was widely disbelieved, and for that reporting, the Podesta Group threatened to sue us, threatened us with legal action for saying anything. Well, since then, not much has gone well for them. They were implicated in Robert Mueller's indictment of Paul Manafort 2 weeks ago. Then Tony Podesta quit the firm in response. He blamed us on his way out. Late last week, his replacement, Kimberly Fritz, announced she was leaving too. Now it's reported the Podesta Group itself will be shut down by the end of the year. Fritz reportedly told employees to clean out their desks and said the company will stop paying them this week. And they told us it wasn't true, and yet it turned out it was. Well, the firm behind the infamous Trump dossier is ready to testify before the Congress. Glenn Simpson, the former reporter who founded Fusion GPS, took that money from the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign, we now know, in order to create the dossier. The dossier, of course, was full of salacious but still unproven gossip, and it was used in the end to justify a far-reaching federal investigation that has turned Washington upside down and basically stopped all productive work here. Kim Strassel serves on the Wall Street Journal editorial board. She's written extensively on this. Recently, she called the Trump dossier one of the dirtiest political tricks in history. She joins us tonight. Kim, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Tucker.
So you called it a dirty trick. It was obviously opposition research. Was it, do you think, qualitatively different than conventional opposition research?
Well, that's a great place to start, because I think we do a disservice when we even call it a dossier. It gives it too much mystique. This is an Oppo research document, but of lower quality than even Oppo research documents. Normally, and look, all campaigns do this, but usually you dig up a driving under the influence conviction, or that you didn't pay your taxes one year, you plant it in the press, it makes the candidate look bad. This is a document based on unnamed, anonymous Russian sources, apparently. They've never been proven. A lot of them have been disproven. But then here's where they were particularly clever. They went, and rather than give it to the press, they sent it to the FBI, and then they briefed the press, and then the press was able to claim that this was intelligence that the FBI possessed, and it gave it some air of credibility.
So, I mean, this bundle of opposition research changed American political history, and not in the ways that it normally would, right? I mean, you're saying that this really is responsible for this chain reaction that's paralyzed Washington ever since.
Well, look at what happened. So, you know, the Democrats like to say, well, this document wasn't even used during the election. Not true. We know that Christopher Steele who put it together. He's testified in court documents that he briefed the press in September. Yahoo News came out with a huge story saying that the FBI was in possession of intelligence showing potential collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. The headlines were dominated by this. And the question that we still have to know is, we know the FBI relied on this in some regard, but did this document actually inspire the FBI to end up wiretapping a political campaign, which is no small deal, by the way?
So I'm unclear. I mean, I think that's right. That's the key question. That would be the most shocking effect of it, because that's so obviously corrupt. But I don't understand why we don't know whether that happened or not.
Yeah, well, the FBI has been playing hardball about letting House investigators see their file. Now, supposedly they've agreed to let them go in. They've started to put some things make available to House investigators. But all of this should be, I mean, the thing that I think some people don't understand is that when you're dealing with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, it's not like you put in a request and they say no. It's a back and forth discussion. Somewhere in the FBI is a big file that explains exactly what the FBI was putting forward to the court as justification to go ahead with the tapping of Carter Page or Paul Manafort.
But I mean, the House oversees the FBI. I mean, I don't understand how the FBI can just ignore that. If I get subpoenaed by House investigators, can I just give them the finger and go to Barbados and just think it's okay? I mean, how are they allowed to ignore that?
Well, it's this separate problem that we have, that the House is having trouble more and more with its enforcement authority. And that is, in essence, what the Justice Department did. They said, sorry, we're just not complying with your subpoena for a while. They now appear to be putting some things out, but from what I understand, not everything that they need to put out. And here's the funny thing, is every time they have an excuse for not giving it, they say, well, it's because of Special Counsel Mueller. Well, if Special Counsel Mueller is actually doing this entirely because the FBI misused a dossier, all the more reason for House investigators to be looking at how this started.
It's unbelievable. I'm going to try that on my taxes next year. No, I just don't feel like paying. Sorry. I'm going to pass this year.
Exactly.
Kim, thank you for that. That was really interesting.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking about the tax bill. It turns out America hands out billions in tax breaks to illegal immigrants and the companies who employ them every year. How does that happen? Can it be stopped? We've got details on that next. Illegal immigrants aren't supposed to be in the United States. That's why they're called illegal immigrants. But they get an awful lot of breaks. In some states, driver's licenses. In California, more than half of all driver's licenses issued last year went to illegal aliens. In some states, they get in-state tuition. They get free health care at hospitals. Across the country, several cities and schools give free legal services to fight deportation. But there is more. In the United States, people here illegally are also the beneficiary of billions in tax breaks. That's actually true, amazingly. Dan Stein, the president of the Federation for American Immigration Reform, and he joins us tonight. This is one of those things where it's hard to believe it's true. How is it true?
Well, we'd like the IRS to stop giving away taxpayer money to people with no right to be in the country, but it's been going on for years. Earned income tax credit, additional child tax credit. One of the things we've been working on is trying to deny businesses the right to deduct the cost of hiring people here illegally as a disincentive. But you know, Tucker, illegal immigration is a big income transfer.
Businesses, just to go back, businesses can deduct the cost of hiring people?
Well, sure. I mean, it's a business expense. And there's a great thing called the New Idea Act. Steve King was trying to get your chairman just on, Mr. Brady, put this into the tax bill. They couldn't get it in there, but it basically would say businesses cannot deduct the cost of hiring unauthorized workers. That would, of course, take billions of dollars away from the incentive that we all subsidize for hiring illegal workers. But of course, they did put in the tax bill a new ban on people who don't have valid Social Security cards from getting the earned income tax credit and the additional child tax credit. Tens of billions of dollars going overseas to people who claim they have dependents overseas, here working illegally, trying to put a stop to that. Now, can we get it to stick in the Senate? That's the big issue.
So who's lobbying against that at a time
when immigration is a big income transfer program? Okay, IRS is in your business and my business, but they don't seem to care enough to try to validate whether someone's got a right to be in the country before they start sending these earned income tax credit checks out, additional child tax credit, even with fictitious dependents. Sometimes people claim from Mexico they got 10 more kids back in Mexico, nobody's ever seen them. IRS is printing checks. And so requiring a valid Social Security card and number, instead of just taking these so-called ITIN numbers, taxpayer numbers, is an important step. But in the end, what we need is for the IRS to work with DHS to verify an alien's status at the time of employment, and then sanction employers and deny them the tax credit, tax deductibility of people working here illegally. Now, you'd think this stuff would be common sense. 20 years we've been working on this thing, and we couldn't get the New IDEA Act on the deductibility in the House tax.
Well, there are massive business interests against it.
They're looking for ways to save taxpayer money.
Can I ask you a 30-second question that I've been meaning to ask you for a year? So after 9/11, my impression was that using fake federal identification or state identification became a really big deal. And I interview people after 9/11, right? The Real ID Act, whatever. But I interview people all the time who brag about being here illegally, working here illegally, using fake federal documents.
Well, under Obama, all the enforcement stopped. And actually, states have administered laxer standards. And what we're trying to do is roll back a lot of the damage the Obama administration did to what were the original 9/11 Commission recommendations that required secure ID, the Real ID Act, and other things. Look, if the IRS doesn't care to check, it's not their money. They're just giving away your money. So they don't want to check to see if someone.
So can I get a fake passport now? As long as
you can fill out a tax return, put in any old number, checks are coming in. They send one woman in Arlington like $10 million in taxpayer money. She filed like 170 different tax returns under different fake names and Social Security numbers on behalf of people working illegally. Let's be honest. Immigration is about income transfer. Businesses make the money, subsidized labor, wages are driven down. A lot of powerful interests fight for that transfer program.
Yeah.
It's costing we taxpayers billions and billions of dollars. We can fix this. FAIR's working to fix this, and we've got some of it in the House bill. How do we make it stick in the Senate? Anybody's guess.
This is not why people voted Republican to see this happen. Dan, thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.
The U.S. Army reportedly, according to an account today, loosening its requirements for new recruits. USA Today reports that under an unannounced policy that began in August, the Army will be granting waivers that allow people to enlist even if they have a history of depression, bipolar disorder, drug abuse, even self-mutilation. Elspeth Ritchie is a retired colonel and a psychiatrist, medical doctor, joins us tonight. Dr. Ritchie, thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
Is this a real story?
It is a real story, but there's historical context. So since World War I, the Army and the military has weighed how many people you should bring on, what should be the accession standards, that is whether they're physically or mentally qualified, and if they're not qualified, whether you can grant a waiver. That is, you look at their record and you say, this is a stellar person, let's make an exception. So the pendulum goes back and forth. Right. Back in 2009, with the increase in suicides, then the Department of the Army Task Force said, we're going to cut out all waivers for a history of mental problems, suicide attempts, etc. Now the pendulum appears to be shifting again to allow people that in many cases should not come in to possibly come in, although with a waiver.
What jumped out at me was not the fact that troubled people going to the military. There's a long tradition of that and becoming really impressive while serving in the military, which is a great thing, I think. It was the mental illness part, because when you buy a firearm in this country, you have to sign a federal form saying that you have not been diagnosed with a mental illness, or else you can't buy the gun.
Correct.
So the idea that the U.S. military would be bringing people in who would be disqualified from buying a gun to carry a gun seemed odd to me.
So there's a few more hoops to jump than just having a mental disorder to being disqualified from carrying a firearm. It may mean that you have to be committed to a mental hospital. And remember also there's a wide spectrum of mental disorders. On one side, there's a psychotic disorders.
Yes.
That means you're out of touch with reality, you're crazy, schizophrenia. On another side, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, which a lot of soldiers who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan have, and don't necessarily impair their judgment or their ability. It means they have nightmares and intrusive thoughts, which, by the way, a lot of journalists do too, because they go through the same kind of traumas. And so this policy is trying to figure out where is the cut line. Unfortunately, I think the cut line is gone too far towards allowing people with self-mutilation, which often is symptomatic of something called a borderline personality disorder or bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorders should not be in the military because they often need to be on lithium. Lithium is a medication you have to monitor. You have to take blood levels.
Yes.
If you're driving down a desert in Iraq in a tank, and you're getting dehydrated, as often happens, you can't be worried about what is my lithium level. So I'm not sure where this came from. I hope the military will reconsider it in the light of some of the publicity, because I think it's gone too far.
Well, it sounds like they're stretched really thin. thin, which is a scary thing.
And that is true. And when we're stretched thin, either in time of war or 16 years after 9/11, then the standards tend to drop. I think one of the things we can think about is one of the reasons they're stretched thin is too many young kids are fat. They don't meet the medical requirements.
That's right.
So if we could have more of a national program to get people to become fit mentally and physically, we could really improve the recruiting numbers.
Doctor, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Sir, thank you.
Federal government is declaring war on a Louisiana landowner for the sake of a frog that doesn't exist. That landowner shares his riveting tale next. Edward Poitevin is a landowner in the state of Louisiana. Like most people, it's his land. He'd like to use it the way he wants to, but the federal government has stopped him from doing that, and all for the sake of an invisible frog. In 2011, Poitevin was informed that his 1,500 acres had been designated a potential habitat for something, we're not making this up, called the dusky gopher frog. The dusky gopher frog does not actually live in Louisiana, assuming it exists at all. The designation effectively bans development of his land, though. Edward Poitevin joins us tonight. Mr. Poitevin, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Tucker, for having me. I appreciate it.
And now, did I misstate that? Have you ever seen a dusky gopher frog on your property?
I have never seen one because it's not there, and it has not been seen in the whole state of Louisiana, according to the Fish and Wildlife Service, since 1967.
So, I mean, this would basically be like claiming you had saber-toothed tigers on your land. Why, since it's extinct, did they claim it was there?
They claimed it was there because they want to have us give over our land so that they can cut every tree on 1,500 acres and turn it into a frog resort. They would absolutely have to maintain it every year, keep the land burned every year, and by the way, we own the property all around it, so would you want to live near a property that is being burned every year? I don't think so.
Wait, so
the frog is extinct.
Well, I'm just a little bit shocked by the irony here. So these are environmentalists in the name of environmentalism telling you they want to cut all your trees down and set fire to your land? That's environmentalism?
That's correct. That is absolutely correct.
Well, that's demented. What did you say?
What I said was, you're not going to take my land unless you pay me for it. And they won't pay me for it. They have certified through their own economists that the loss of value to us is $34 million. And they refuse to pay for it because it's not a taking legally.
But they want to cut your trees down and burn your land in the name of protecting an extinct frog.
A frog that does not live there and has not been there for many, many, many years, probably even before 67. What their official literature says is that the frog has not been seen in the entire state of Louisiana since 1967, not to mention my land.
So what's your just for our viewers at home who might fear they have a dusky gopher frog or two on their property, what's the recourse here? What do you do when this happens?
Yeah, well, the recourse is you have to go through the motions of going through a show trial, which they call a public hearing. They gave me 5 minutes to speak, along with a lot of very strange people who got up and talked about the frog might cure cancer one day and silly things like that. You then have to suffer through a long period of comments. They issue the rule as they said they would, and then you have to sue them in federal court to reverse it, and then if you get an adverse ruling, you take it to the Court of Appeals. We've done both of that, and we are now going to the U.S. Supreme Court in the hopes that they will see common sense and logic and the fact that this law does not actually allow that, and hopefully reverse the lower court's decisions.
That's unbelievable. Environmentalists who want to cut your trees down and burn your land. Mr. Poitevin, thank you, and Godspeed. We're rooting for you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Tucker.
Thanks. Well, the New York subway system has a new scheme to make people feel welcome. We'll tell you about it next. Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, making big changes to improve the experience. They're not fixing widespread delays, or not cutting costs, or not adding efficient new routes. All those concerns are on the back burner until they've stamped out the real problem, drivers who use gendered language. The MTA is telling train conductors and bus drivers to stop using the phrase ladies and gentlemen when making announcements. Why? Because the phrase conjures up the sinister notion there are only two genders, while cutting-edge scientific research by Facebook has shown there are actually millions of genders, with more being discovered every day, like Hindu deities, an infinite number. MTA employees have accordingly been given a list of acceptable terms like passengers, riders, and everyone. Dallas New Yorkers already feel safer. That's it for us tonight. Tune in every night at 8 to the show that's the sworn enemy of lying, pomposity, smugness, and groupthink. Our one-year anniversary tomorrow night. Good night from Washington. Sean Hannity up next. Hey, Sean.
All right, talk.